What is crack-a-lackin', fellow thermonuclear AFers? I am Dan Favale coming at you with my certified fantabulous and thermonuclear AF co-host Grant Hughes, and we are joined by the incomparably certifiably fantabulous and thermonuclear AF Keith Smith from Spotrac, knows everything and anything about the NBA, the CBA, and of course the basketball games that are being played at large. Has been on this podcast like 4 or 5 times now, so it's officially his own fault for coming back. We are no longer hoodwinking him. We're excited to talk with him today because it's trade deadline season, and who better to have on than Keith? Follow him on Twitter at Keith Smith NBA. That's spelled exactly as it sounds, which is always super fun. It'll be on the screen or in the podcast and YouTube description as well. Keith, one, welcome back, and two, how the heck are you doing?
I'm doing good. It's like you said, it's trade deadline time, right? We're getting down to it. We're what are we 8-9 days away now, and we're almost there. It's a great time. I love this time of year. There's a million things going on, and it's funny because people are like, "Do you like it more than the off season?" And my standard answer is always yes, because there's games too, and that's my. Even though I'm like Mr. Salary Cap and roster guy, and I love all that stuff. I love games most. Like I love the game most of all. So like this is the best of both worlds.
You actually can't like both. I'm sorry to tell you.
Yeah, right. I know.
That's not allowed.
Feels that way.
If you appreciate transactions, you hate basketball. That's what.
Yeah,
that's what the theory is.
Grant, that's what Twitter has told me at least.
Grant, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm glad to be here. I'm really excited for, and no pressure, Keith, but Keith to just kind of set us straight on what we should be thinking about the trade deadline and second aprons and things of that nature.
Yeah, to that end, I wanted to start there, Keith. Before we're going to eventually exchange our most interesting or fascinating teams that we have leading into February 8th, but because it's topical and it's engendered just a little bit of debate on the timelines. How do you feel about the 65 game minimum when it comes to awards now that we're more than a half season into it in practice? And it's, of course, Joel Embiid's the one that's defined. Even Tyrese Halliburton a little bit came back for Pascal Siakam's debut and then ends up missing some time. Have your initial thoughts on it changed at all or evolved at all?
Evolved maybe might be the best way to put that. I think I understood where the league was coming from. I have no issue with the idea of there needed to be some incentive to get guys on the floor more. I didn't like from day one when it ties into anybody who's already signed or is eligible to sign a so-called supermax deal or a designated player contract. I don't like that because I think that's going to lead us into guys getting like coming back early, like Halliburton. I know that the spin has been, he was excited to play with Siakam and he was cleared to play. I'm guessing there was some push of, hey, I might have $40 million on the line here if I don't come back, and make sure I hit the 65 games. So I don't love that part of it. I want to know more about, it's embedded in the language. There are some like extreme cases that they'll consider guys. I want to know what that means. I've been told that was more around the idea of like if a player had a death in the family, it needed to miss 2 weeks and had already missed 7 or 8, 9, 10 games or whatever, and it pushed them past. That would be something maybe they could look past. But I don't know. It's a little for me. I think we're making a problem now that didn't necessarily need to really be fixed.
Yeah, I wonder if. Like you said, it makes sense that, there's been a lot of changes made to incentivize the biggest names being on the floor as often as possible. But I wonder if maybe this was a little bit of an overthink just because, let the voters for MVP or whatever else decide if 61 games of this level of production, how that stacks up to 74 of this level of production. I don't feel like that's such a big ask, but it does seem like we are, it always happens, whether it's a CBA changing or just a specific rule, there's these unintended consequences. And now, like you're talking about the money that's at stake. And I feel like suppose Embiid sustains these averages and plays under the 65 game threshold, which seems likely now, it might, if we didn't have a Jokic having this kind of season again, it might feel weird to look back at what he did and say like, oh, he didn't win MVP. That's bizarre. Like how did that happen? And it's because of, we just drew a line in the sand rule wise. I'm fascinated to see, like you are, Keith, sort of like what what changes we might see going forward. How long is this going to, stick around? Because maybe you're probably the right person to ask about this. That lower threshold for whatever the extenuating circumstances are still needs, is it like 62 games? Is it 63 games? Is there a number that if you're below it, we're not even going to consider special circumstances?
Yeah, it's all very vague. It's not specifically laid out like no matter what you have to play 60 games or anything like that. There's nothing that quite says that. So that's part of the issue, right? Where it is, geez, like, where are we going with this? Like that's where I do kind of wonder, like what are we going to come up with? Where then our team's going to start to play games, right? Where it is, oh, this player's out for personal reasons, and we really shouldn't get into why, and that's totally fair. Like I think back to the Andrew Wiggins stuff last year, it got to, in my opinion, like got super gross what the people were putting out there and saying it happened and all this stuff, and it's like, you know what, we don't really need to know. Like, I do think there is some level of transparency we need to know of, like, hey, he may not be back, or maybe 2 months or whatever it is. And then we can always adjust and go from there. But I don't even know the reason every guy is out. Injuries, that's a little bit of a different thing. That's just, ingrained in sports. To your point, though, where I think it can get a little weird is, let's say, what happens if you have a year where the top 3-4 guys who everybody's like, well, those would have been my top 4 MVP picks, and they're not there. And now it's like guy number 5 wins. I do think, though, I'm not super worried about that, because I think somebody pulls up that season in Basketball Reference or the list of MVPs, they're gonna be, what happened that year? And then they're gonna dig into it a little bit more, and then you have a kind of story behind it. So that part I don't worry about too much. I think we get too caught up in, for the historical record and all these things. Yeah, I kind of get it. I am far more concerned when it comes down to, like I said, a guy like Halliburton, where it is, hey, this can really impact how much money this guy makes. And, missing one more game, do the Pacers care about that? Probably not, right? They probably will, because sure, they'd love to have him for less money, because that's a smaller cap hit, and that's just going to be, more flexibility for them down the line. But I do think it is a little less. I just, like I said, I think you're fixing a problem that I think most voters took care of anyway.
Yep.
I will be curious to see if it gets like a quick reconstruction or repeal after the TV deals are negotiated, and then all of a sudden we just see it disappear. I am wondering, I'll throw it to you first, Keith, since you're here, though, very quickly on it. Is there one of the awards, whether if you're talking about all NBA versus MVP and we're looking at the availability, is there a point where it matters for one over the other, where it's, let's use the MVP discussion, where if Joel Embiid plays in 61 games, isn't it fair to say that 72 games of Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, this version of Shai, is more valuable than only getting 61 games of this version of Joel Embiid? So is that, like, does it matter more in the MVP discussion because the word valuable is there, and then all NBA should be the straight best? Do you find that there should be a differentiation there? Or is it just kind of like same shit, different category at that point?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I do lean the way you said, where it is, hey, if they're pretty close, and this guy played in significantly more games, played in 10, 12, 15 more games than the other guy did, and the numbers are not crazy far off, the team records are not crazy far off, I'm going to go with the guy who played more, because that just is, to me, that is more valuable. He was there almost every night. Or in the case of, an increasingly fewer amount of players every year, was there every single night. So I am 100% in on that, where it is like, yeah, if that's where a guy gets to, but let me decide that, right? Like, I don't need the league kind of arbitrarily saying that. And then all NBA, I think you can have a little bit more leeway where it is there. I'm very curious to see what happens with the whole positionless all NBA stuff, because, we keep heading down this path. We could literally be 2-3 years out from Embiid, Jokic, Wembanyama, Giannis, probably still LeBron and KD, AD. Like, or all of a sudden, is it going to be like, man, it's really hard to make all NBA because it's filled with all bigs? 10 of the spots are big men. And if those 10 guys are the 10 best players, okay, I guess that doesn't really matter. I kind of did like all NBA telling the story of by position. But that's because like I grew up on an NBA where the argument every year was Hakeem Olajuwon, Patrick Ewing, David Robinson, and then all of a sudden here comes Shaquille O'Neal, right? And then right on the heels of him getting Shaq was there day one, but a couple years in now was like Alonzo Mourning, and it was like who's gonna bump the centers out of there, right? And that was a fun debate. You really look to figure all that stuff out. I think those are the things we kind of miss a little because in today's world, probably all would have made it, right? And then it's like they all did, and then it kind of almost becomes like the All-Star game in a respect where it's like, all right, well, we got the top 10 guys in the conference, and then the last two spots are really between 5 players, like who's going to bump them out and that sort of stuff. So I would have been fine with doing that. Hey, we've got a limit on for the truly individual awards, MVP, maybe Defensive Player of the Year. Rookie of the Year doesn't have them because that's kind of its own weird thing anyway. But yeah, and then all NBA, all defense, we can have a little bit more leeway. I think I would have been okay with that.
Yeah. The trade deadline. So looking at that, are there any themes or unintended consequences from the new CBA that you see impacting this deadline or that you're curious to see whether it impacts the deadline? I gave you a few examples like in the actual outline, but I'm just curious what you're like kind of actually monitoring or looking for as we get towards February 8th.
Yeah, I'm gonna do two things kind of combined here, if it's okay. I'm gonna combine the trade deadline and the buyout market. They really are they run in conjunction with each other. They really are tied together in a lot of ways. And I think we're gonna see changes in behavior on the team side and the player side. I'll talk the buyout market part of it first because it ties into the trade market too. But say a guy like Kyle Lowry, I think is still very likely to get a buyout if he's not traded. And I don't think Charlotte will find a trade for him. But I think he's in a spot where even if you're the biggest Kyle Lowry fan in the world, 1 or 2 productive years left, maybe as a 15, 20 minute a night backup guard. So I think that's where for a guy like him, that makes sense. And there are enough good teams that can sign him that he makes sense for, that he maybe does take a buyout. But if you look at his now teammate, even though they'll probably never play a game together, Gordon Hayward, I don't know that taking a buyout makes sense for Gordon Hayward because Gordon Hayward is probably looking at it and saying, hey, I still have like another whole contract in me before, my career is said and done, or I'm kind of a year to year kind of guy. And if I'm Gordon Hayward, I'm going to look at it and say, all right, well, I'm going to take a buyout. I can't go to Boston, Milwaukee, Phoenix, the Clippers, any of those teams, because they're all over over the first or second apron. So I can't go there. So that takes those teams off the list. That shortens the number of teams I can go to, eliminates the ability to just, hey, catch on with a contender for the last few months of the season and figure it out. And I think Gordon Hayward may look at it and say, my next contract, using my bird rights, maybe in a sign and trade, I might be able to get 15, 20 million. On the open market, I'm probably not getting that. I'm probably capped at the non-taxpayer mid-level exception, which probably be about 13-ish million. So I think that's where I think that'll change the behavior. In years past, Gordon Hayward would have been a no-brainer buyout guy. So it would have been, I'll take the buyout. I'll go catch on with the team. I'll win a ring. And if that means I have to forfeit a little bit of money on my next contract, well, it was worth it. We'll figure all that out later. So I think that in turn will change the trade market, where now you've got teams that I think are going to be looking to, all right, can we find a way to make a trade for a guy like that? Can we move off some of the salary for one of those teams that's more towards the bottom of the league? Are we going to find it harder to move those big expiring salaries because teams maybe aren't in position to take them on? So that's what becomes really interesting about this one to me. And then the fact that you do have all these apron teams, both first and second apron. And then you've got a couple that are like right at the luxury tax line. What does that look like? Where are those teams going to go? Because one, for some of them, it's hard to make moves. But for some of them, this is also like last chance saloon time, where it's like, if I'm the Clippers and I have PJ Tucker's contract, I could probably pair that with maybe one other contract on my books and go get one big time player that will really push us forward, maybe all the way to the top of the Western Conference, if they're not already there already. And that puts them in a spot where it is, this is it, because next year everything gets that much harder. You're down to making 1-for-1 trades, can't take back more than you send out. You're down to, and I shouldn't say 1-for-1, because you could always do, you send out one guy and take back two. What you can't do is kind of aggregate together combined salaries to go get somebody where you're in their position. So I'm very curious to see how those teams act, just because of this is it. The way the Phoenix Suns treated the summer was, everybody was like, all right, hey, you have a year, get your stuff in order. The Suns kicked it off, but then you had the Bucks and the Celtics jump in and like, yeah, you know what? Last chance. Like, let's go. Let's load up now, and we'll let tomorrow be tomorrow. Tomorrow's problems be tomorrow's problems. We'll figure that all out down the line. So I'm very curious to see how that all comes together.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. As you were talking, I was just thinking, Phoenix and some other teams, and I was going to mention Milwaukee, very much like didn't tip their hand like league wide. But if anyone was curious about, is anybody going to view this ticking clock on, the rule changes coming in as an impetus for certain teams, like certainly it's not a good strategy for everyone, but to really just say, well, we got to do it now because we can't do it later. So whether it's the Clippers or not, Dan, I thought the Clippers example in the outline was kind of perfect. This idea that, like, we're definitely going to be in the second apron unless somehow we don't bring back Paul George and James Harden for whatever reason. So this is our shot, right, to aggregate, because we can't do it anymore. I do think the fact that Phoenix and Milwaukee and some others operated as they did several months ago suggests that there will be teams that, and that's not to say they're going to act rashly, but might do things that, were the rules not going to change for them, they might not necessarily do. I think that feels likely based on what we've seen, so far in this new CBA environment.
I'm also curious, and this doesn't apply necessarily to second apron teams, but you look at, and we've kind of already seen the Heat make a decision that they traded a future first round pick. I look at the Lakers, the Mavericks, maybe a couple other teams fall in there where it's, well, you can trade a first round pick now, but like you wait until the summer, and technically when you factor in the actual pick that you're making this year or whatever happens with New Orleans and LA, well, now you can trade 3 first round picks. And so you kind of have to juggle that urgency of, well, we have LeBron, we have Luka and Kyrie, but like we can have extra picks in the summer and theoretically up our return there. So if it's the difference between, like, if you're Dallas and you can get Jeremy Grant now, do you do it? Or is it, like, we should wait into the off season because maybe we can get in on a higher end sweepstakes? Like, you're not going to ever have enough to get like Mikal Bridges or Larry Markkinen, but like 3 first round picks is just more than one. Like that's just simple math right there.
Yeah.
Let me add an additional layer to that, Dan, because I think another thing for certain teams, you need to be really solid in your projections for where you think you're going as a franchise. Because if you start trading away picks and then you become a second apron team, now you're really limited to how you can build your roster.
Right.
Phoenix is the perfect example of this, because what I've been saying is, just to keep it simple, because all this stuff gets very confusing on what can teams do, what can't they do. If you're a second apron team starting next season, you're pretty much limited to 1-for-1 trades where you take back the same amount of money or less, and you're limited to signing your own draft picks or minimum contracts. Well, if you're the Phoenix Suns, your 1-for-1 trades are pretty limited, because most of your tradable bigger salaries are tied up in key rotation guys or starters for you. Their only non-minimum contract that doesn't start for them is Nasir Little. The other 5 that they have are their 5 regular starters of Durant, Beal, Booker, Nurkic, and Grayson Allen. So you're limited there in your tradability of contracts. We all know picks wise, holy cow, they are out, like, forever of picks. I thought Zach Lowe has put it really well when he said they Horcruxed some of their first rounders with swaps and the like to be able to pick up some seconds, because that's really what they did, right? It was like, hey, let's trade whatever we can just to get some seconds, so we have a couple seconds in the door to sweeten the pot in the deal. And then really, as we saw this summer, you're down to signing minimums. So that's where, if you're the Lakers, let's say, and they're probably not a great example because a couple of their guys, AD and LeBron, are a little older. Who knows? LeBron may never retire, right? It seems that way some days. But I think you look at it and you say, you got to be kind of careful trading picks that are too far down the line because we are the Lakers. If we can flip this thing very quickly, which they've done in years past, and we become super expensive, now all of a sudden we're out those picks, and we not, and everybody's like, yeah, but they become frozen anyway. Yeah, that's true. They would become frozen, but you don't even have them. Never mind, it's frozen as the 30th pick. You don't even have it. And then all of a sudden it's like, well, I hope we can hit on 7 minimum signings. And as you've seen with Phoenix, I liked a lot of their minimum signings over the summer. They haven't all panned out, and that becomes very, very hard to do because your roster is super top heavy. So that's another thing that's going to factor in for a handful of these teams. One of them I'll save because I want to talk about them later, but you got to be really cautious with. Yeah, I very firmly believe when you're close to winning a title, go for it, because title windows are never as big as people think. Right? They close way quicker than people are thinking. Like Oklahoma City, everybody's like, they've got the next 10 years. They don't. I nothing I believe in more firmly than it will not last 10 years for the Thunder. Maybe it'll last 5 or 6, but it's not going to be 10 years of this. It just isn't. That's just not how the league works. So you're really close. Like, go for it now. And they're a completely different stratosphere, right? Because it's you could go for it all in and somehow still have chips left to play with later just because of where they're sitting.
Yeah, you would think if any franchise was aware of the of overestimating its title window, it would be Oklahoma City, because in 2012 no one could stop talking about how this team was going to be here forever, and it never made it back to the it's super finite. Dan, I don't want to jump on Dan if you had something to ask, but just talking about these draft picks, Dan and I talk about this a lot as we're trying to think of trade constructions or think of what teams' plans ought to be going forward. The value of a first round pick, I would say, probably bottomed out fairly recently when you're seeing, 4 and 5 and, 3 and several swaps going really in the last 18 months, I guess. And certainly they were more highly valued, at least if you're looking at them as pieces being involved in a trade in years past, where it was, I could just distinctly remember discussing Bojan Bogdanovic several years ago, probably in the context of the Washington trade, where it's like, is he worth a first? I don't know. Where do you think we are in terms of the value of first round draft picks? And I think you probably can't discuss this without thinking of certain specific situations where you really can't give these up, because if you hit the second apron, then you got nothing. Like, where are we, in the ebb and flow of what firsts are worth right now? Because you just look at Zach LaVine hypotheticals or DeMar DeRozan hypotheticals, and those are all typically pick heavy discussions. But it just seems like nobody's really sure what a first is, keeping aside the fake firsts, their ridiculous protections, the lesser of this and that, and they'll convey or they won't type of things. Where are we on the value of first right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it is still somewhat team dependent. For example, the trade Miami made with Charlotte.
Yeah.
I don't really worry about the Heat giving up a first round pick, because nobody's better at plucking an undrafted guy out of the G League and developing them into a rotation player. The Thunder, I would have no issue with them trading any kind of first round pick because they've got a million of them. In a vacuum, like if you were just to say, hey, today, you know what, we're going to reset and everybody gets all your own picks back and we're going to restart this thing, I think it would be, I think then it really comes down to, are we an organization that believes in building through the draft, or are we going to build through trades and free agency? Because it's always, and it's never, people will say, well, you're going to build through free agency. That's not a viable path, because just the way the NBA works, by the time you sign 2 free agents, you're kind of, now we're out of cap space and, there it is. So it's really trades and free agency. So I think if you believe that we can draft and develop and we can get there, those picks become super valuable to you. That's why you're reluctant to move any of them. That's also why you are so gung-ho on getting them, right? Like we're going to get them in trades. Now, I think there becomes a tipping point in every organization where they become a little too precious. The Memphis Grizzlies, I think, have been a little too precious with, we drafted these guys. We can't trade them. And now what's happened is you've kind of, I know they're in the super weird spot right now where everybody's injured and they have hardships, but just in a world where they're healthy, you've run out of roster spots and you're not no one bats 1,000 in the draft, right? Like you miss on some guys, and then the next thing you know is like now we're really expensive, and now we have Jake LaRavia on a rookie scale deal. Normally that'd be great, but do we really want to be paying him $5 million to never play? Maybe we should have traded him when he was still a little bit more of a mystery box and he was an unknown, and we could have sent him out somewhere. So it's between the players and the picks, but I think picks still have a ton of value. I think it's whether it is to be used as currency in trades, just to be used as draft picks. I think what's happened is you had teams that were the Gobert, the Mitchell, the KD trades. It was teams that were like, man, we want to be in it, right? We want to be in the mix, and we have a chance to get superstar X who doesn't really come available all that often. Let's go. And if that's what it takes, let's load up and go get that player. And then you invariably, though, those trades, if you win a title, fine, it worked, right? Even if you win one title, it worked. But if you don't, I have yet to see the one where it's by the end, it's like, man, I kind of wish we had that one pick back, right? Like I wish we had that pick. So I think they're still super valuable. It's just it's very organizational dependent.
Do you make, before we get into the teams that we're all thinking about, do you make anything of seeing so many, I would say, consequential moves happen like before deadline day? The Harden thing was its own, just another Harden trade demand, but like OG, Siakam, then even kind of the Rozier deal getting done a few weeks before the deadline. Do you think that says anything about the way teams are thinking? Do you think it says anything about what's going to happen like leading up to the deadline? Could it be quieter than usual? Does it maybe just portend more chaos than usual? What did you kind of make of just seeing four, but really just three of these deals kind of happen within a 2-week span so far in advance of the deadline itself?
Yeah, I love that question because that gets into that again, a little bit more philosophy from different teams. I think if you are the Knicks and the Pacers, I think they both made a read of we're pretty good and but we have holes, right? We're good teams. We really want to be top six, ideally pushing for home court advantage in the first round. I think they were very realistic to understand we're probably behind Boston, Milwaukee, and Philly, but let's be the top of the next tier, right? Let's get home court advantage. And I think what we have now seen is there's a benefit to being an early mover because instead of the Knicks getting OG Anunoby, and this is taking the Randall injury and all that out because now it's even bigger, right? That they have Anunoby. I know he's dealing with something too, but it sounds like that's pretty minor. But I think for the Knicks, you saw the immediate benefit of moving as early as they did. They went up in the standings. They've been playing great and they continue to play great even with Randall out last night. So I think that's important. I think the Pacers moved on Siakam because it was, let's not let this get to a place where, all right, we'll throw you 2 first-round picks that we weren't going to do before, plus really good young player X that we were holding on to. Like we're ready now to go in because maybe we slipped in the standings and things aren't where we want them to be. And then from Toronto's side, I think Toronto, those guys have been on the market for years. I think we could safely say to some degree, even if they hadn't traded them. And I think Masai Ujiri and Bobby Webster have a pretty good read on, unless some miracle team in their eyes gets super desperate, it's probably not getting better than this. This is probably where we're at. So we might as well move now. And then we get the added benefit of let's kind of see what this looks like together a little bit. Then if we want to move Bruce Brown, it'd say, let's go because we don't really see him being a guy here long term. You have that benefit to say, hey, we got him and we flipped him. And now our overall Siakam return is maybe instead of being what they get, the 3 first rounders from Indiana, it really turns into 4 first round picks because we flipped Bruce Brown for an additional first round pick. And that's why I think you're seeing those early movers. And then you have other teams that are, I think we're okay. Like, let's wait. And then I know there are teams because they've told me direct, they believe waiting until noon on trade deadline day, that's sometimes where you can get the best values. Because now all of a sudden some team is sitting with a guy who it's like, man, we were holding out for a first round pick for this guy. We're not going to get it. And there's only 2 hours to go till the deadline. all right, we'll take 2 seconds for him, and let's move. And that's sometimes where those teams believe, let's hold on. So I think it's very team by team specific, but it's that to me makes it almost way more interesting and fun, because if everybody waited until deadline day, it's Andrew Brandt. I don't know if you guys know him. He's a football guy. He was like the Packers GM. He tweets every time there's something related to a deadline spur action, right? And it's so true, right? Because everybody's like, man, we've done nothing. Like, we got to go. And I think that is definitely true on it. But I do think you're going to see teams now, because we're seeing every year now somebody makes some form of early move. I think you're going to see that happen more and more often, where teams are like, what are we waiting for? Like, we know what we are. We don't need to wait till we played 50 games. We know what we are at 40 games, 35 games. Let's go make the move if it's available to make now. And then let's reap the benefits for an additional 5, 10, 15 games.
Let's get into the teams that we're most fascinated by or think might define this deadline. Keith, you are the guest, so first licks go to you. Who's your first team?
All right, so this is a team I spend way too much time thinking. This is where I turn into Mr. Salary Cap guy. I think more about the Minnesota Timberwolves and their future than I probably factor in my own kids' college plans, which is bad. And just kind of tells you who I am and how bad of a father I am. So I am endlessly fascinated by what is going to happen with the Timberwolves. They, as probably everybody knows, they're in the midst of putting the final touches on being sold. The ownership group of Mark Lowry and Alex Rodriguez had to bring in additional partners to get that sale over the line. So that tells me they're not walking in at like Matt Ishbia and like, billions of dollars for the team plus $500 million in payroll and taxes. Let's go. I don't think they're there. Like, I think they're going to be more of how we got to be a little bit more cautious here. With that said, they have, and I should have had this already prepped, they have just on the books for next year and guaranteed money for 5 players who are 5 good players. It's Rudy Gobert, Karl-Anthony Towns, Anthony Edwards, Jaden McDaniels, and Naz Reid. All good players. Still only 5 of them. $165 million already on the books. The luxury tax line, and while we've been recording, Shams just tweeted the cap projection, official cap projection from the league came in $1 million lower than it was before. So that is telling us the league's setting the teams up for we may not be in as great a shape as we thought going forward. And I think a lot of that's related to these regional TV deals and some of the things the league and some other partners are doing to kind of bail teams out of those. So that means that tax line is going to come in even lower. Effectively, they're a tax team with 5 guys on the roster because you have to fill out the roster. And they've got a few other guys who make a little bit less money. So just with those 5 guys. The name I didn't mention there is Mike Conley, their starting point guard. And anybody who watches the Wolves knows anytime Mike Conley's not on the floor, it kind of all goes to crap. They don't function as well. And even Mike Conley, at his advanced age and everything else, I think they're going to do what they need to do to re-sign him, unless he's like, I'm good, I'm retiring, or I really want to play my last year somewhere else or whatever. I think they're going to do what they need to do to bring him back. That's probably going to be $15 to $20 million. They're going to be so deep into the tax without making a move. And I got to wonder, either I kind of have them on a clock of now through the next 6 months. Mm-hmm. What are they going to do between now and the start of the offseason to maybe mitigate that a little bit? Do they move off of a deal? Because this is also a team that's not perfect. They could use another bench scorer. They could use a backup point guard. They could use somebody else to come in to help lift them. But boy, are they locked in. And the last thing I'll say, even with this new, the cap and everything's going to go down a little, they are also in a position where Anthony Edwards and Karl-Anthony Towns, if they make All-NBA, they both jump a salary tier up. So that number I told you, that's on the low side. Like we estimate that on the low side. So if that number goes up, now we're already well over the tax line with only 5 guys under contract plus a handful of other guys that are closer to minimum deals. I I think about it all the time of where is this team going? Because the last thing I'll say, they don't even have the draft picks to like trade to get out of a deal if they need to. Not that they should need to. Those guys are all good. If they want to move one of those guys, they should be able to do it without having to give up draft capital. But even if we're a year or two down the line, it's like, yeah, this is crazy, and Towns aged poorly and his deal's now turned sour. They don't have the draft picks to even get out of it. So I am just endlessly fascinated by what happens with them.
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting things about them is the line when someone raises the alarm, which correctly I think you did, they'll say, well, you have until the end of next year, right? If you want to try to get out of the tax. So it's like, oh, the urgency for this offseason is not really there. We're making too much of this. But it's like, so then in this hypothetical, the Timberwolves are probably a first or second or third seed in the West next year at some point. And so at that deadline is when they're going to try to dump Karl Anthony Towns, and like
Exactly.
there's no that's not a solution. There's no scenario where they do that. So it really is this offseason, right? And Towns is the guy that always gets mentioned, but in terms of the timeline, it's not really true that they have until the end of next year to make this decision, because it's just so unrealistic to imagine that they would start trimming massive salary in the middle of next year when they're probably contending, right?
Yeah, I would be stunned if it is a, hey, we got to move. Maybe at that point, if let's say we're at next year's trade deadline, we're a year from now, and they're like, man, we can really get by without Naz Reid for some reason, and moving Naz Reid for a guy who even makes $5 million less gets us out of maybe at least out of the aprons, and we're just like a normal tax team. Maybe then you could see something like that, but I think it's just going to have to be a bigger decision later, or they're just going to have to really say, or you know what, we'll pay it. We'll figure it out. Like we're gonna pay the taxes, because I gotta believe someone's having a conversation. At least I hope, with the new owner saying, "Hey, this is the best literally it's ever been here, outside of maybe a couple of KG years. You cannot make your first decision coming in. Hey, we got to start breaking the team up because it's too expensive. Because you'll lose them. They will turn on that ownership group before they've even watch their first game from the owner's suite, right? It'll get really messy with that. So you got to be really, really careful.
Looking at them in the context of this deadline, do you think the impact is if they actually can acquire someone to upgrade their bench, like a ball handler, a shooter, a point guard, and it's, oh no, Javon Carter has money on the books for next season, so that's a no, but we'll go after an Alec Burks because he comes off the books after this year? Is that like the extent of what it might impact? Maybe they do nothing, or they're just not willing to take on anyone who, Javon Carter doesn't make a lot of money and he'd probably work on this roster, but no, he's on the books for next year. And like, we can't have that right now.
Yeah, it might be. You may be looking at that. I personally think that's where everybody has Kyle Lowry pegged to Philadelphia. I don't know that Philadelphia needs him. Quite frankly, I think they've got enough at the guard spot already between Maxey, Melton, and Beverly. Like I don't see it. Like why they would need Kyle Lowry beyond. It's a cool story, right? He's a Philly guy, so he'll be going home.
Right.
I think he would fit way better in Minnesota and be a way more important piece there, because now Conley, figure by the time you get to playoff time, you split the 48 minutes between those two guys. If I'm Chris Finch, I'm like, all right, good. I never need to think about that position. Right. I'm good. I've got my minutes, and Lowry in a 15-minute a night, 20-minute a night backup role on a playoff team, probably mostly against second units, you're probably fine, right? Like let him kind of do his thing. He's overmatched as a starter now. He slipped too much defensively, I think, to really have an impact there. But just a steady hand who can be like, whoa, chill. You're taking 30-foot jumpers with 16 seconds on the shot clock. Next play, we're going to actually run something, get it inside. Like that's what you need when Conley's out of the game, and they just don't have it. It gets too messy. I love Jordan McLaughlin for what he is, but Jordan McLaughlin's not telling Anthony Edwards, breathe, man, give me the ball and go. Like this play, you spot up. We got to get the big touch. Go Bears run the floor 12 times in a row without touching it. Like that's what Conley does for them, getting one more guy. So, and that would be the benefit of you're signing him as a buyout guy for the rest of the year, and then you kind of roll that decision into next year. That's perfectly fine. So yeah, it's a very interesting spot for how they treat the trade deadline, because I just don't know that they're gonna be in a spot where, to your point, like Javon Carter would be really good for them. I just don't know that they're going to want to take on $7 million on next year's books if they don't have to.
Grant, who's your first team?
Well, I like that starting with the Wolves as a macro concern. I'm going Atlanta in sort of more of a micro sense, and that's focusing specifically on DeJounte Murray, who it seems to me, and I've gone back and forth on this, Dan, you and I have talked about it. It seems like he is sort of the, or should be the most likely big name to be traded just because of all the ridiculous adjectives we keep hearing describing Zach LaVine's level of trade interest around the league.
Barren, Grant.
Barren, frigid. We like to add our own, desolate hellscape, all kinds of things like that. But so Murray just profiles, is a cleaner fit almost anywhere. He can play the one, he can play the two. I think it's difficult to judge like how well he'll fit with certain other guards based on how he fits with Trae Young, because that's a big ask and it's a strange fit in general. It's 4 years, 114 million. Extension starts next year. So he seems like someone that there should be several suitors for because of his sort of plug and play status, because of his reasonable deal, because Atlanta seems very, very likely to move him and maybe some other guys we can talk about as we get further into the Hawks. And I thought initially that means that Atlanta is going to be able to just haul in a mint for him because you'll have multiple suitors. You can, play them against each other. You're going to drive up offers. The fact that he hasn't moved and the fact that we haven't heard reports of such and such team is in discussions with, involving 2 firsts and something else makes me think I was wrong about that, because I just don't understand how, because what seems to be happening is teams are maybe lowballing Atlanta. And I didn't see that as like even remotely possible just based on the market circumstances. So what the Hawks do with Murray, and to a lesser extent, guys like DeAndre Hunter, Clint Capella, Bogdan Bogdanovic, AJ Griffin, even, what they do with those guys is really interesting to me and could kind of dictate the deadline to some extent, because all those guys could be fits and help out someplace. But Murray to me is most fascinating because I was just dead certain that this guy was maybe he wouldn't get the Hawks back everything they gave up to get him in terms of pick equity and things like that. But I thought for sure that the Hawks were just in a really strong negotiating position, lots of leverage. We don't have to do anything because he's under contract. So let's hear it. What's your best offer? And I thought they'd get pretty good ones. And so far it doesn't seem like that's happened. And so that's just maybe the most interesting. I don't know, that's what I'm kind of watching for, just to see like how off was I engaging DeJounte Murray's market, and what does that mean for the rest of the trade deadline? So the Hawks are really an interesting team to me, even though there's no question about are they buying, are they selling? They seem very clearly ready to sell. I'm curious how they go about that and what they get in that sales process.
Sorry, I was muted. That's because I was typing a minute ago. Everybody's now reacting to this whole salary cap is coming in lower stuff.
It's funny how $1 million sends NBA Twitter a flutter.
Well, like
it does.
in Miami.
Not just that, but like
all my
Spot Track. Spot Track, that's a lot of work for us to do. You'd be surprised. I think, Grant, for you, I don't know that you're as off as you maybe are feeling like you might be on Murray's trade value. I think what it is a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks out from the deadline. I don't need to give you 2 first-round picks. Mm-hmm. Maybe desperation increases. Maybe the Lakers lose a couple more games and they find a way to get something else to Atlanta. Maybe another team is like, all right, you're holding firm. All right, we'll throw in that other pick there. They're certainly not. They had these designs on, we'll get back what we gave up for them. I don't think that's going to happen. I think that's gone out the window now. I think there is still the chance of, hey, give us a balancing trade where maybe we get somebody who's much more of a 2 that can come in here and play off ball, and we get a couple of picks that we can at least sell. Hey, we got 2 first-round picks, even if one of those is a little bit more one of those. It's a first, but is it really going to be a first?
Yeah.
Are you ever going to see it as a first? It's almost kind of like the ones Indiana sent Toronto,
right?
Where it's like, it's a first, but like it's probably going to be like the 28th pick.
Yeah, if you get it, it'll be in the 20s. Basically. Yeah,
so that's where I think maybe that's the way this kind of goes for Atlanta. But I think the Hawks are being smart on it. They are holding the approach of, we don't have to trade him. Like, we can still turn around and trade him this summer. Mm-hmm. If we want to do that instead. Like we don't need to do anything today. So I think they're taking the right approach of, We don't need to take a bad deal just because we have to get him out of the building.
Mhm.
And I'm going to keep using him as an example. This is not Pascal Siakam, where he is a unrestricted free agent next summer, and it seems very likely he's going to walk. Had Murray not extended his contract, I think they'd be far more motivated to make a deal because we don't want to lose him for nothing. But as it stands right now, I think Atlanta, rightly so, is like, hey, you may want to trade. And this probably spills into the Zach LaVine territory a little bit too. We don't need to make a deal. We don't have to do anything. We have the control here. You don't have the control. And to Murray's credit, he's shown up and he just plays, right? He hasn't made a big deal out of this. I think it was almost like shortly after he like had 2-game winners in a row. So it's like clearly the guy's still out there doing his thing and trying. So I think that's important to note in all this too is, everybody's acting, shocking for the NBA. Everybody's acting like reasonable adults here, not being morons where it's like, I'm openly quitting on you. So now you have to trade me or not play me.
They're also interesting because so what's the extent to which they will sell? Because everyone's talking about Murray, but what does this mean for Bogdanovich? What does it mean for Grant mentioned DeAndre Hunter? What even is his market? Can you find someone who likes Clint Capella? You have Sadiq Bey, who they valued pretty highly based off the second round equity, that entire like 80 team trade or whatever it ended up being cost. So I'm just like, who else on this roster could go? And it seems like Trae Young and Jalen Johnson are off limits, which I guess makes some sense. I'd probably be more callous and be like, well, what's your best offer for Trae Young? And maybe they don't want to do that because they'd be embarrassed by what the best offer for Trae Young might be at this point. So I'm with them. I'm just curious to see even if they don't move Murray, they're a team that pretends like they don't care about how much their payroll is, but they care about how much their payroll is. And so they're going to do something, even if it's not Murray. And so even if it is Murray, it's just, well, who are the other dominoes that are going to fall and what can they get? Like, is DeAndre Hunter worth a first-round pick to one team? There are people who think his contract's terrible. There are people who think he's undervalued. They have so many divisive players, like even right down to Clint Capella. Right now, like Onyeka Okongwu's kind of trickled his way into like the speculation factory. And that's like kind of another question where normally these guys who signed extensions, it's, they're not going to be moved. But when their extensions are so reasonable, like him and Denny Avdia, and there's the more flexible salary matching rules for teams below the apron, it's like, well, like, could someone come in there and see what they could do? So that's what I'm also curious about with Atlanta. It's like, does anything happen beyond Murray and what is it?
Yeah. And you've also got, like in the case of Washington, they're sitting on a couple pretty good sized trade exceptions too. So if even in the imbalance type of trade that it causes in a poison pill situation, when you're sitting on a trade exception, or in the old world, if you were sitting on cap space, you could make the imbalance trades one way and the other way because it was easier to take back more money because you were just, you had that ability. Atlanta's a little harder to just take back more money just because of where they're sitting. But yeah, I mean, they've made it pretty clear. Don't call on Trae Young, at least publicly. You better not tell people you called because we're just going to say we shut it down. And then we don't want it. We have no interest in moving Jalen Johnson, and we don't really have any real interest in moving Onyeka Okongwu. But for me, I'd also be like, but you also seemingly have no interest in starting Onyeka Okongwu. So where are we going with this conversation? My guess is what we're going to hear is, I don't know that Trae Young is like franchise lifetime Atlanta Hawk. I think there's a chance he gets moved sometime within the next year or two. It's not going to be in the next week and a half before the trade deadline. I feel very confident in that. But I think, let's say he gets moved this summer by next deadline. I bet you the story comes out, hey, at the 2024 trade deadline, that's when the idea was planted. A team called and said, hey, we really like Trae Young. And maybe it is a situation, you talked about it before. We don't have the picks today, but in June, July, we'll have 3 picks we can offer. We'll have 4 picks. We have this that we can offer instead. And I think that's what we're going to hear is every so often you get one of those where it's, the teams talked. It just wasn't the right time then, but that was where the discussion started. And whether that's like this summer or next summer, I bet it'll be written like the conversation started way earlier than anybody thought it was started, just because I think that's where Atlanta's eventually going to have to go with this if they can't find the right mix. My guess is they're going to give it one more go. Like, let's rebalance this roster a little bit, trade a few guys. Let's try to get the right guys around Trae Young and move forward. And then we'll just kind of see where it is from there.
Since we just spent so much time on 2 glamour markets like Minnesota and Atlanta, I'm going to take us to a smaller one in New York. The Knicks were fascinating to me for obvious reasons beforehand because of their assets. And they've also been, just dating back a few years, one of the teams, this front office, which probably hasn't gotten enough credit for it, that are championing the rolling over these salary slots so that we can use them in future trades. How do we upgrade? Yeah, Evan Fournier can be on the books next year if we want him, but he has no trade value. And so I was interested in that to begin with. But now the Julius Randle shoulder injury, going to miss probably at least a month. And we're never going to know the real timeline until he's back. They're just going to obfuscate it like they have with Mitchell Robinson. Does that increase their urgency when they already had a need for like some extra guard or ball handling depth after losing Emmanuel quickly? And then what are they prepared to do? Because to go back to DeJounte Murray, they've been linked to him. And when you're talking about a package of, well, 2 picks, maybe one of them is not great, and you get another guy who could play off the ball, you just described like the Knicks picks and Quentin Grimes and then salary, and you're there. I know people aren't crazy about that fit, but for them specifically, they're one of the teams that leads me into the question of, well, even if DeJounte Murray is not the perfect fit, given what you need right now, and given what his value might be in a subsequent trade, does it actually make sense to have him rather than, let's say, Quentin Grimes and one of these good first round picks, and then like another one of the whatever picks, whether it's Washington or Detroit, which may never convey? Or are they going to try? Like, I don't see the player who's out there. They're not going to be a Zach LaVine team. And by all accounts, it doesn't look like Larry Marketing or Mikal Bridges, who I love in New York and basically everywhere else, would actually be available. But does this injury for Randall, coupled with the Robinson stuff, coupled with how good they've been playing, push them to be more aggressive than we were kind of thinking? They just feel kind of like a wild card that we know they're not going to sell, but they could go in a bunch of different directions. And it does feel like, even though they already, maybe if they made their biggest trade already, okay, fine, like they're still going to do something that has an impact, one, on this season, but two, on the blockbuster everybody is waiting for them to pull off over the summer or in future seasons or off seasons to upgrade that Evan Fournier salary slot. And so I'm so very curious to see what type of player they target there, who's it going to be, and how high do they ultimately aim? Because I do think the Randall injury specifically, even though they expect him to be back, those are fickle. The dislocated shoulder, that's a fickle injury to come back from. We don't know what his mobility is going to look like or range of motion from there. I'm just so curious to see how they handle this deadline.
Yeah, I mean, those shoulder things too can be something where he's fine, and then all of a sudden it's out again, and then you're hurting with that, right? So I think that becomes kind of one issue there. I think you brought up a lot of things with the Knicks that become interesting. I threw out to a friend of mine, I said, would you think about doing something like Fournier, Grimes, and maybe a pick or 2 picks or whatever it needs to be to go get DeJounte Murray, but say, hey, now we need Sadiq Bey too, because we got to get through the next 3 weeks, month, or whatever. We need one more forward in the rotation. We just need one other bigger guy. Because I also am very curious, like, it sounds like this OG Anunoby elbow thing is not a big deal, but if that becomes a big deal, all right, what are we doing here? I know they signed Taj Gibson again to another 10-day contract, but like, come on. Let's get serious here, right? Like,
Woj reporting that, by the way, when Woj includes an explanation point in the news break. Yeah.
Yeah. It is like, are we really gonna play Isaiah Hartenstein and 4 guards like all the time? Like Josh Hart, I mean, he openly, like, I'm not making it up. It was funny the way he put it, but he's like, yeah, unless I can gain 45 pounds of muscle, like, right? So it's like, that's totally true. So I think there is a point where I think priorities maybe have changed now, right? Instead of all right, we got to get another wing ball handler creator in here. Maybe now it is, all right, now we're in the forward market. Who's available? Is a guy like Bojan Bogdanovic now way more interesting because we could use somebody like that just to kind of plug in there. Is a guy like PJ Washington, who's on an extremely acquirable contract. Could we go there? The Miles Bridges stuff is just so weird. It just doesn't seem like a move they'd make, but could that be a way you go just to get another forward-sized player in the mix there? Because to me, they can get by. If Anunoby's okay, they're going to be okay to get by for the next 3-4 weeks, whatever it is. But then my question becomes, if this becomes a thing like Paul George's did, where it is like, oh, he's okay. Oh, it's out again. And now he's out again for another. If that becomes a thing, now all of a sudden it's like, if this happens in game 3 of a playoff series, like, where are you going? And that's where you start to run out of options and it gets really messy. So I think if you could get somebody who's either on a really good friendly contract, maybe you go that way. But yeah, I mean, the Knicks are people say this to me all the time with Fournier. They're like, well, they got to do something, right? Because otherwise, there's no way they're going to pick up his option. If they don't trade him, I think they are picking up his option.
Oh yeah.
And then you roll him into a trade asset all the way through a year from now. So you're really on a 1 year clock with Fournier, right? Like you're through now through next trade deadline. That's the way I'd be thinking about his specific contract. And that feels tough to me because I'd like to see Evan Fournier go somewhere and get a chance again, because I just don't believe he's completely done as a basketball player. I just find that hard to believe. And it's never going to happen in New York for him. So that becomes like, where do we go, with this stuff? So the Knicks, again, another team, really, really interesting team there, because I think the Knicks, the Cavs, the Pacers, the Heat, I'm leaving somebody out in the East.
The Bulls would like to be included in that discussion.
Sure, yeah. They can like that. And, as my dad taught me a lot as a kid, wish in one hand and crap in the other and see which fills up faster. That's they can like whatever they like. The good luck on that one. So I think it's, for me, it becomes, where are we going, with this? What are we kind of doing with a couple of these teams? Because I just think it's a, spot where they're all really close. And I know everybody's like, yeah, but are they close enough to beat Orlando? Of course, my adopted hometown team is the one I left out. It is the everybody's like, yeah, but are they going to beat Boston? Are they going to beat Milwaukee? Can they really beat Philadelphia? Well, Philly, who knows where they'll be at health-wise by the time we get to the playoffs. And then all you are is not Joel Embiid, but if Giannis has an injury, or Middleton, or Dame come playoff time, or Porzingis is down, all of a sudden now it's a much more winnable series than you were in. And you kind of owe it to yourselves to, without getting crazy, kind of put yourself in the best position to beat one of those teams if you can.
Keith, who's your second team? Oh, sorry, Grant.
No, go ahead. That's enough Knicks. I want to hear Keith's second team.
It was actually, oddly enough, even though I forgot him, it is Orlando, because I think for the Magic, we're at a very interesting point for them franchise-wise, where it is, I tweeted this after they lost the game to the Grizzlies a few nights ago. Then they had a good win over the Heat, I believe it was. And then they had a bad, not a bad loss, but a loss last night to Dallas, where they fell apart. They fell apart in the most predictable way, which is the Mavs were able to kind of clamp down and get stops when they needed against Paolo and Franz, and everything's just so hard for them otherwise. So I think the Magic need to have a very honest conversation, which I assume they have had, of what are we trying to be? Are we content enough to have made our step forward? We're a play-in team, and maybe we win in the play-in tournament. We get knocked out in the first round of the playoffs, and that was enough of a step forward for us this year. We'll do our bigger stuff this summer, and we'll figure it out. Or are they a team that says, we want more? We can be as good as the Knicks, the Cavs, the Pacers. We can be in that group that's competing, in the 4 to 6 range in the assured playoff spots, and maybe put ourselves in a position to win a first round playoff series. Because if they want to do that, they have every tool imaginable to go make that happen. And I'm not saying this is the guy, because they don't think this is the right guy for them. But if they were like, go get Zach LaVine, they can match the salary really easy with pretty much whatever way the Bulls want to match the salary. And they've got draft picks that they could send that way to say, hey, here's a pick or two and let's make it happen, and off we go. Or if some other guy becomes available, like is DeJounte Murray a guy they should be going after? Just give them one more on-ball creator, ideally a playmaker versus just a pure scorer, who can just make life easier on Paolo and Franz. Instead of them having to run everything where they set themselves up or they set each other up. One more guy who can take the reps of, all right, hey, I got you. Like, you're going to set the screen and roll, versus you have to be the pick and roll ball handler and then shoot a contested jumper or work really hard, late clock, plow into the paint kind of plays. I think Orlando's just in a really interesting spot, because you've got Markelle Fultz on an expiring deal. You've got Jonathan Isaac on a pseudo expiring contract because he's non-guaranteed for next year. You have Gary Harris on an expiring contract. There's a lot of directions this team could go, and they could even get involved on a team like Chicago, where it is, hey, we want this guy, and we're going to send you guys who can still help you this year. Like, we could send you Gary Harris and Markelle Fultz, who could. Fultz is a little different because the Bulls have a ton of other ball handlers, but like we can send you guys who could help you this year be a good team, and you give us a guy who can really help us moving forward. So I just think Orlando again, one of those teams where it's like, where are they going to go with this? Because if it's not now, it's got to be this summer. Because if it's not, you're going to be starting to get really expensive with retaining your own guys pretty soon. And then all of a sudden you might have missed your window to add to this roster and put yourself in a different place. And then that becomes a tricky question. You really have to have what's kind of our 3-year plan in mind, right, starting today all the way through the next few years.
Yeah, it does feel like a timing question for them. And you alluded to this, like, it's not an asset question. If you want DeJounte Murray and you're the Magic, you can do that. That's easy. The question I think for them is, one, is there something better for us out there if we wait until the summer? And two, like, what is the value add in addition to just like, we'd like to level up, of having Murray in the fold for the balance of this year to sort of see what that looks like with their forward driven offense otherwise. So that is actually a theme I think that comes up a lot for, we'll get to some of these teams, I'm sure, but it's just like, is now the right time? It's not a question of can we do this or can't we, or like, do we have the assets? It's, if you're the Thunder, do we do it now? We should probably just get to them next. That was going to be my next team anyway. But it's always, and the Lakers and Dallas are actually kind of weird flip sides of this, where it's like, do we do it now or do we wait until we have up to 3 firsts to trade in the summer? And what's the cost of not doing it now? Does that mean LeBron, we lose, this is the last year of LeBron finally, and then we waited and now we can't anchor a team anymore? Like, so that's a real through line of this deadline to me, is there's several teams, and several of them are young teams that have the ability to get better if they want to. I mean, just throw Utah in there too if you want. They're a 500 team that could get way better if they wanted to. Is now the time? And that gets into like a deep philosophical question about like how are you, like, what's your plan for this team? Like, when do you want to be good? Do you think it's worth trying to be good now because tomorrow's not guaranteed? Like, I think that's a real theme. And so I guess that's just to jump to the Thunder, Dan, unless you had Magic thoughts.
They should absolutely trade for DeJounte Murray. That's my Orlando.
Yeah, why not? I think it makes sense, and give up several high-end assets so that I'm justified in thinking that that's what Atlanta was going to do. That's what the deadline's about, is just making sure you're correct, right? That's what we're in it for. The Thunder, though, like, if you follow the league at all, it's like they've got this treasure trove of assets. They've already they sort of have too many picks and young players because they came into this season with like 25 guys on the active roster and had to just start trimming. So you can't use all those firsts. They have a fairly clear need to me for a bruising 4-5 that can play with Chet, that you might have in your 8-man playoff rotation, might finish games for you potentially. And it's just, and you've got the Giddey, if there's a team out there that's more convinced that Josh Giddey is a cornerstone piece than the Thunder are.
Can I
There's your young guy
there for a second?
Please.
Josh Giddey, the way that teams are defending him, like, to have to worry about the playoffs, right? I know a lot of Thunder fans think they don't need anything and they could win the title right now. The fact that you're just comfortable putting bigs on him, letting him do whatever, that's going to be a problem in the playoffs. Or you mentioned kind of this bruising 4-5. I'm like, they need to upgrade the Josh Giddey spot to have that another playoff ball handler that gives them some jiggle and joggle that'll be defended. And maybe that's Case and Wallace long term, but it's not necessarily Case and Wallace right now. I know he's had on the court like better stretches of late. They need to move on from the Josh, maybe not Josh Giddey himself. Like, they need to upgrade the Josh Giddey spot if they're going to make the most. It's just where I'm at with this window. I'm not saying it needs to be this season, but I guess that's like, I tend not to be too inflammatory, but that's like a hill I'm prepared to get stabbed on.
It's the wrong team for him. It's not, I mean, that's why I mean, there's another team that could justify giving him the ball just a lot more. And that negates some of the, the detriment of his non-shooting. And it makes his poor defense hurt a little less because, he's on the ball and he's doing stuff that we need him to do as a facilitator, which I think, like, there's a world where he succeeds. He's just like a bigger Ricky Rubio or something. Like, he can be something like that for someone, but it will not happen for the Thunder. And so, like, that's what, not only pick wise are the Thunder asset rich, they do have he's so young still. You forget because he's been in the league a little while. There's another team out there that could say, like, this guy was a high lottery pick that has been productive box score wise, and we can see the outlines of what kind of player he could be. So the Thunder just, other than having like a huge salary to trade that they don't care about, like they have everything they need. And it's
they have that Davis Bertans.
Well, sure, yeah, that's another thing. They've got money to get off of. So the question really just is for them, like, do we do it now, right? Because and that ties into, well, what does that even mean? Is that Lauri Markkanen, who's probably not available, but like the Thunder could make anyone
they could
available.
Make him available if they wanted. Right. The Thunder have the assets to make anyone they want.
That's what I'm saying. So I don't have an answer. I think I'm probably, if someone called about Giddey and I could move him for a piece that made more sense, I would do that in a heartbeat. But I don't know if it's the time, even though we just talked about like title windows, which the Thunder's seems open, or at least open-ish. They're not going to last, it's not going to be 2029 and we're saying like, oh, we're just getting into it, It's like, that's not how it works. So I'm just really curious about what they do, because they've been hoarding these picks for something, and it's not to just draft a bunch of guys, because that's not a real way to build a team. You can't sort of do that.
Yeah, you're on it, Grant. You can't, right? You're running out of roster spots. Like that's the thing. And that's the thing some teams they're waiting the Thunder out on a little bit, where it is, let's go. And they had a challenge when they tried to make trades in a few past drafts. Now they've been able to do it in others, as other teams have moved off picks and have been like, okay, yeah, we could use some extras, where they tried to bowl teams over with offers, and teams were like, then we're just going to be in the same spot you're in. Like, we don't need your 7 first-round picks to move up 5 spots, because then what are we going to do with them? So that's one challenge. But now I think you have enough teams where it is like, holy cow, we're pick poor. Like, we could use a couple picks back. For me, I know you guys focused on Josh Giddey, and I'm not against that, because I think you're absolutely right. Like, the way Boston guarded him with Porzingis, or better put, didn't guard him and just let Porzingis float. Yeah, Giddey shot well and was a big part of them winning that game. But they think if you're a playoff team, you're going to say, okay, do it 3 more times and beat us, right? Like do it that way. And I think teams are like, it's just not going to happen. I'm also a little bit there with Lou Dort too. I don't think
both those guys, by the way, weren't really closing. They weren't there for closing time against Minnesota on Monday night.
And that's why I'm a little bit there with him too. I think, one of the two is the spot you upgrade on. That doesn't mean one of the two is traded to me. I think you have other spots, and you move the other one to a bench role where they could thrive. In a lot of ways, I think if you move Giddey to a bench role, I think then now all of a sudden, now we have that extra ball handler on the bench. We've got somebody who could come in, play behind Shea and J-Dub, and we're good, right? We're set. There's our 3 ball handler rotation. We could kind of leave Cason Wallace in the secondary creator role that we're pretty comfortable with him in, instead of force fitting him into something or overextending Shea Gilgeous-Alexander. So I think you're in a good place there. I still hold go get another big, but for me, it has to be a 4-5 that can play with Chet and back him up. The guy I'm kind of looking at for them, and it sounds weird because he finally got traded after like 7 years of trade speculation, is John Collins. John Collins is shooting the ball well again. Whatever was going on with his finger seems to be solved, or he's at least figured out, all right, this is how I now have to shoot. He's making shots. He's been playing the 5 almost exclusively for Utah, but we know he can play the 4. You slot him in there, you could go get him, I would assume, relatively easily. Bertans and a pick or 2 to Danny Ainge, and you're good. And then slot him in, whether you make him your starter or you play him as a high minutes backup, a guy there, but he can play with Holmgren. He could play behind Holmgren. And I think you're in a really good space if that's where it is. Because I think Markkanen, I just think that's a little too pie in the sky. I don't know that you're getting to where the Jazz. I think the Jazz they're right on the tipping point of we've got a lot of draft equity already. Like we would have to get Cason Wallace plus somebody else. I would be saying I need Wallace, Giddey, and Jalen Williams, the big one. Like I need those 3 guys, and then we can talk matching salary and draft picks. And if I'm the Thunder, I'm saying then no, right? That starts to get too far the other way. So I don't know for Markkanen, but I feel like for Collins, that would make a lot of sense.
Yeah, and also then you roll over the Bertans salary slot into a player who's more compelling theoretically in future offers, at least. Like John Collins is just not going to have a ton of trade value, but he's going to be viewed as more valuable than Bertans. Speaking of John Collins' current team, I have the Jazz on here because I mean, you talk about a team that could do anything. And I mean, I do sometimes feel, not to call out all Jazz fans, but I do feel like some or many Utah Jazz fans underestimate the degree to which Danny Ainge does not give a fuck. And just like we saw it kind of last year where they were this plucky team and he tore it down anyway near the trade deadline. And some people would argue in retrospect, you didn't do it soon enough because it kind of took you out of like the super, I love who they ended up with in the draft and Taylor Hendricks and also Keontae George, but like you kind of exited the Victor Wembanyama sweepstakes and Larry Markkanen's great, but he's not Victor Wembanyama. And so, no, I do not expect him to trade Larry Markkinen. I think just because of how good of a story it's been, I would not trade Larry Markkinen. To me, that's not off the
table.
He
wants to be there. That's something you have to factor into. He's very happy there.
Especially there, right? It's not like Utah is going to, we got all this cap space down the line. We're going to be free agent players. Like,
I will say,
who wants to stay.
I will say Utah is a more desirable free agent destination than a lot of people think for two reasons. One, when they're in Utah, people leave them alone. Like it's a smaller place. It's pretty quiet. If you're the kind of guy who's like, hey, when I'm home, I want to be home and not being bothered. I want to be able to go out to eat and not get bothered every 2 seconds. People like that. It's also for the guys who are like, yeah, but it's Utah. There's nothing to do. The minute they find out, oh, it's like a 30-minute plane or helicopter ride to Las Vegas.
Yeah,
let's go. Like we're fine. Like let's make it happen. Like because trust me, if you go back, I'm not going to name names, but you can go back and look through some of the free agents the Jazz have signed. And it's like, I'm surprised that guy went there. And then when you factor in, Las Vegas is very close. There's a few guys you'd be like, okay, I get it now. I kind of understand.
James Harden to the Jazz confirmed.
You've just controlled my brain for the next 2 hours. I'm going to think back about Jazz signings.
You'll figure them out pretty quick.
Okay.
So what I would say though is with this, with the Jazz, to your point about Danny Ainge, doesn't care at all. They could be in the play-in tournament. And if what he believes is the right thing to put the Jazz closer to a title is to trade a guy, he will trade the guy. And punt on this year and say it is what it is. Hey, we made the best move for the Jazz to win a title at some point. Like that is his sole goal. Like it's people laugh about the whole Danny Ainge because part of it is he loved to tell the media directly. And then I think by the end of his Celtics tenure, he was leaning into the jokes of, we got really close.
Right.
But then it was like, we got really close, but he wasn't even saying names. It was just like, we got really close on some stuff. And it was like, oh, okay. He knows. Like he's a pretty self-aware guy. He knows the joke of that. But I think it was for a while there but it wasn't going to it wasn't trading this player, and 3 draft picks wasn't going to put us closer to a title. Yeah, it might have made us a playoff team, but that's not what we want to be. And quite frankly, I think he's been proven to be right. Celtics are title contenders every year because he didn't trade Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown. Everything else is ancillary to that. Like Brad Stevens has built on that with other really good moves for guys and really helped flesh out the roster. But it was Ainge's steadfastness to say, I'm not trading the picks that became Tatum and Brown, nor am I trading Tatum and Brown, the players. That's what's really launched Boston in the title contention more than anything else. And they've been there now for what? We're on like year 4 or 5 of them sitting there. Have they broken through yet? No, they haven't, but it's still something to be said for you're right there every single year.
And that leads, we've mentioned Markkanen's really the only player we mentioned than Collins, but like this whole discussion we're having is Chris Dunn, Fontecchio, Colin Sexton, Jordan Clarkson. Like those are the names the Jazz were going. And look, they haven't necessarily made it easy to figure out what they're doing because they go through this scorching hot stretch. And now they've lost, 4 of 5 or 4 of 6. And so like they've come back down to earth a little bit and the West is still a bear, but you could also kind of see them. I think people would expect them to sell, but I could also kind of see them. They have all these assets where if they rolled some of them into a DeJounte Murray because they have so many picks and they said, well, he's going to be more valuable to us both on the court and as a trade asset than maybe some of these picks that we have. It's something that helps us now. And maybe we go after the play-in and we don't really care about this draft anyway, since so many people seem so low on it. It feels like I wouldn't predict it, but they are a team that has been at least shown enough glimpses where, could they make kind of like a, aim for like a smallish or medium-sized buy now play that they think still sets them up well for future trades without harshing their rebuild or their reset. And so that's why they're so fascinating to me, is that they literally, everyone could just expect, oh, Danny Ainge is going to, trade all the guys that I just named, or a few of them. What if he just goes out there and consolidates a little bit? Like, that is something that's on the table for them.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, there are things they would do where I'd be like, holy cow, I did not expect it, but I would also not be surprised. I know that maybe sounds like it's contradictory, but I wouldn't be surprised if we got the Woj bomb in the next 10 minutes that they traded Lauri Markkanen. I'm not gonna be like, well, I never saw that coming. Like, all right, it's Danny Ainge. Like, if he believes whatever he got for him is better, like, yeah, it's surprising, but I'm not gonna be shocked by it. I'm not gonna be like, well, that is completely like came out of nowhere just because that's what he does.
Let's each see if we could do one more team, if you don't mind sticking around with us, Keith. And who would that be for you, your third team?
Yeah, I think so I played, in the small market sandbox here with my first couple. I'll go a big one. It's the Warriors. Like, what are they gonna do?
Let's go.
I just, are they gonna try to load up and try to salvage this and make a run? Are they going to trade guys away to try to clear up the books a little bit down the line? Can you get off Wiggins' contract? Is that something they might be able to figure out? Chris Paul, it's always seemed highly unlikely to me Chris Paul made it through the trade deadline. If he does, he's going to get moved this summer, if not just flat out waived. So those become the things where I look, like, where are they going with that? And like, nobody has out and out said they're open to trading Klay Thompson, but every time one of the like insiders talks about the Warriors, they always throw in at the end, and maybe they could look at trading Klay Thompson or some version of that. I still find that hard to believe. I don't think Curry, Green, and Thompson get broken up yet. I think you almost kind of let them decide when that's going to happen. Draymond's probably the one where maybe they do it. Let's say he has another incident. Maybe then they're like, all right, we're done. Now, but by then maybe the league's like, no, we're done. like that's how this ends. But it is, I think, I've said this ad nauseum. The only way you ever trade Stephen Curry is if he walks in the door and says, I want to trade. Like, that never happens. Like, I don't care if you win 25 games for the next 3 seasons. You just see it out as, here's what it is. It's just, I would never do that. Now, I also do believe if he came in and said, hey, I want to trade, I think you kind of owe it to him to at least see, right? Like, all right, can we find something that works because of everything he's meant to the franchise? But it feels like something's going to happen there. Like something, I just can't see them going through the trade deadline saying, well, yeah, let's just play it out with this group the rest of the way. I feel like something's going to happen with the Warriors.
The floor is yours, Grant.
No, I mean, I feel like I've talked about I think you're right, Keith. I think it does feel like something has to happen. If it's anything beyond Chris Paul moving and like maybe Moses Moody or someone like that far down the depth chart, I'd be surprised, just because all these guys, like the Thompson thing, I would be so stunned for so many reasons if he were traded. One, he makes $43 million. And like, who's looking to get that on the books? Even if it is expiring, who's got the money to send back that the Warriors would want to take on for that? And you've got the sentimental side of things. The Wiggins thing is like, if you trade Wiggins, all you're doing is trying to trade him for someone who's as good as Andrew Wiggins was 2 years ago. Like, and good luck doing that for a number that is close to his salary number, which, like, at the time he signed that extension, everybody thought, what a deal. This guy was just the second best player in the finals. Like, that's phenomenal. So I think, and I also really like, at the very bottom of it all, there's not a trade out there that gets the Warriors, who are 19 and 24, into like upper tier title contention. So what's the point? Like, that's the thing for me is if circumstances change and some crazy name becomes available and, there's a pathway to a big trade for them. Okay, sure. But like if you could put Zach LaVine on this roster and give nothing else up, you are still not in that conversation as a like true blue title contender, and ditto for anyone else that's available. So for them to, consider moving someone like Jonathan Kuminga, who, Dan, I've been vindicated. He's on fire these last several games. Like, that's just that's a non-starter at this point.
they're confusing specifically because of what both of you has mentioned. Keith talking about like the salary implications and some of the players that, they're kind of fading and what do they look like long term. And then you're mentioning, well, there's no one on the market that's just going to resurrect their title window anyway. And then even if there was, they're not going to have the best offer. And so it kind of behooves them their offer doesn't get a ton better in the summer, but you could at least play around with a 2031 swap since and also you have the 2030 pick that's like fake to Washington. You could trade the second 2/3 of that, whatever it is.
That one a little bit.
Yeah, you can work off. Yeah, that's what we need to call it now. Keith was right. So I don't know
that's
what
Zach Lowe's term. Let's be credit where credit's due.
And so like I don't know what they do beyond like if they make a move, like Keith, like what is it to do? And the other thing is like I think they probably still believe internally. Grant's point about Kuminga being on fire. Our whole thing has been, well, you can't play Wiggins and Kuminga together, but when you play Wiggins and Kuminga together with Draymond Green, it's a small sample size. They're blasting opponents right now. So there's probably this internal belief like, well, what are we going to go out? Who are we going to go out? Like even a DeJounte Murray, I actually think we've mentioned like 80 times. He does intrigue me for this roster, especially if you can attach one of like the others in Atlanta, if it's Bogdanovich or even Hunter, who I'm higher on than most. But like, what is that going to realistically do for them? It just feels like, is there one, if they're actually making a move, Keith, what would you expect it to be? I know it's Chris Paul, but is it just kind of cleaning up their cap sheet? But two, is it like, do we kind of just expect them to do nothing at this point?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot to unpack there. I'll try to do it really quickly. I think the runs the Lakers and the Heat made last year have people's like whole like perception is just off.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I just think people are in a weird spot now where it's like, well, they did it, so why not us? And for me, it's like, all right, that happened, but like that's not going to happen every year. Like, well, what are we doing? So that's part one of that. I think part two is I do think the more likely trade is clean up the books trade. Like Chris Paul is coming off the books pretty much no matter what next year. Wiggins, if we can get out of Wiggins deal, let's do it. Like if we can do it without having to get crazy, like let's get out of that contract. I mean, maybe there is a team that's like, we actually think he could come in here, help us get to be where we want to be, and we'll give you back a deal that even if it runs 2 years shorter, like then we're good. So I think those are the kind of two moves. Under no circumstances at this point would I trade Kuminga or Podziemski in any kind of deal that's chasing a win now move for the rest of this season.
Free Moses Moody though, please. Just free him.
Yeah, Moses Moody, I'm fine with it. I'm kind of the point with Moses Moody, it's just never going to happen there. Like there's now too much history of it just hasn't happened. And it's not going to. He's behind too many other guys in the rotation. And I just think there's been plenty of opportunity. It hasn't happened in those opportunities, so it's not going to be a thing. So now if you can move him in a deal, fine. But I think it becomes, I wouldn't be chasing upgrades for the rest of this season just because I think you're chasing after a dream there, right? You're chasing after, we get some product. Could they win in the play-in tournament and get in as the 8th seed? Sure. Are they beating Denver, a healthy Clippers team? The Wolves, the Thunder, I mean, maybe they could beat the Wolves or the Thunder. They don't have any kind of track record. But I find it hard to believe they're going to be able to do that and win on the road 3 times in a row to get to where taking on, like Grant said, Zach LaVine, taking on somebody like LaVine would make sense. I just don't see that being a thing that I would do. And I think they're smarter than that as a front office. And I think hopefully their guys also understand, hey, being down for a year or two, it is not the end of the world. Now, it's harder to bounce back. All those guys are older, so it's not going to be as easy as bouncing back like they did this last time. But maybe that's, where their process is, all right, fine, we fall a little bit, we fall out, but we'll be back. And again, I just think it's imperative if they can get out of the aprons for next year somehow, free up the ability to use, exceptions and that to kind of flush out the roster a little bit differently. The base is there of a team that can be pretty good still. I truly believe that. So I wouldn't go crazy trying to make it better right now.
Grant, who is your third and final team?
Let's talk Sixers real quick. I think, all along, once the sort of roster revamp happened where they get a bunch of expiring salary back and they get a couple picks to add so they can trade, I think up to 3 firsts right now, post Harden trade. Their path forward has just been really confusing to me because there's this, and Daryl Morey has talked about it, like if there's someone out there now, we'll do it. We've got the assets to do it. But if not, we've got, $100 million in expiring contracts. We could have all this cap space. We'll play the free agent game. And it's just sort of how do they go forward knowing Joel Embiid is as good as he's ever going to be right now, and we should be pushing for a title. The market sucks. Like there's nobody that we really need to go out and there's no-brainer acquisition to them that I think meaningfully levels them up necessarily, but the ones that might probably eat into their cap space next summer. So it's kind of like, how do they thread this needle? That's really just the underlying question for me for the Sixers. And because it does seem like they're so clearly positioned to do something with all their expiring salaries and the picks they can move, and they should be feeling some urgency to do something. But then there's this sort of like, well, we've got plan B where we could just like, I don't know, I guess re-sign Tobias Harris next summer, or somebody else like DeRozan, like all these guys that they might, DeRozan's an example of someone they could trade for, but like, why, so they're just interesting in that they've got a couple of pathways to improve the team, one short-term, one long-term, and all these assets to do it. There's no clean fit. There's no easy fix. The market is not their friend. I don't feel like at this particular deadline, they kind of got a raw deal in some ways, because in past deadlines, there might be a half dozen guys that they could be targeting. Now there's like 2 or 3 that really would be like even average difference makers, I guess, if that's a term. So got my eye on them. They're just kind of interesting because of their situation.
Yeah, I'm with you. They're interesting into Daryl Morey's going to do something, even if it's not a big move. I like to say he's like the tinkerer, right? He's always tinkering with the roster throughout the year, and I think he'll do something, even if it's a smaller move. I just don't know that the big move comes. It also wouldn't surprise me if a big move does come, because I think Daryl Morey may look at it and say, hey, there's nothing we can do in the summer that we can't do right now. And again, we get the added benefit of we'll get to see what a playoff run looks like with player X in place. But is that guy Zach LaVine? I don't think so. They've seemed to indicate it isn't. They indicated it wasn't Pascal Siakam. I've heard some people say they're dreaming of Paul George and maybe other guys. That seems like, okay, we'll keep dreaming, because I don't think he's leaving the Clippers after Kawhi extended with how well they're playing. So that becomes like, where are we going? Like what is, they're a dream target, sure, but like, what is the real plan target? What's our realistic place we're going to? And that's where I think, maybe that sends them down a slightly different path of maybe it's not one guy. Maybe it's like 2-3 guys that make $20 million a piece. And you're like, hey, that's how we're going to do this. We've got our 2 max guys with Embiid and Maxey moving forward, especially in the next season. And we feel like the best way is to have a bunch of guys that are on mid-range contracts that can then be flipped somewhere else instead of loading it up and going and getting that one other expensive guy. I think some teams are starting to look at it and say that is not the way to build forward.
My final team, I want it to be like Detroit, but I'm more terrified at what they could do than interested. I want it to be Chicago, but I don't trust them to actually actually tear it down. They're just addicted to the sub-middle. I want it to be the Pelicans, but I feel like the move they need to make is just too big for it to happen mid-season for it to matter. So the team I'm settling on is the Houston Rockets. Are a curiosity for me. They have some contracts they have many contracts that are easily to be moved, but just looking at, the Jock Landale, the way that whole deal is set up. And then they owe their pick to Oklahoma City this year. It's top 4 protected. And like, as of now, they'd be sending the 8th pick. And so it's counterintuitive to say, well, this team should be buying, but it's also like, because they're outside the play-in right now, but they have a top 5 defense. And there's some noise there because they have the best opponent 3-point shooting, but they do a relatively good job of limiting wide open jumpers. Like the defense feels there's noise there. Maybe it's not top 5, but they're a better defensive team. Like they're way above average. And so you're looking at some of the teams in front of them when it's Utah, and you're looking at the Lakers, feel like a house of cards, and sometimes the Mavericks, and the Suns are there. You have all of these other future picks, not all of your own, but like you have some of these Nets picks. Could you do something? Like they could do anything, to be clear. Like, do you do something of, well, we need some offense. And I know people have mentioned ball handlers, but even on the scale of like a Bojan Bogdanovic, if the price drops low enough for him, could come in, give you some shooting, another score that you can play at the 3 or the 4, depending on the defensive personnel you have. And like you have Fred VanVleet, you have Dylan Brooks, you have Alperen Sengun flirting with all-star consideration right now. That on top of your pick commitment to OKC, is there any just underlying urgency that we all kind of talked about it in the offseason and now it's just kind of faded because all this other stuff is happening? But they're a team that I feel like could be extremely active because they have the assets and internally the motivation to do so.
Yeah, I'm with you. I don't have a great read on what they're looking to do, but I think they are very focused on let's keep this moving forward. I thought it was reported recently, Chris Haynes was the first one I heard reported that Robert Williams could be in play for them. Now, that's a future move, right? That does nothing for the rest of this season, but that's the kind of smart move where, hey, maybe we could get him cheap as we're ever going to get him right now, then we can benefit. And I think Ime Udoka, better than most, knows this guy's probably best role is as a 15 to 20 minute a night big off the bench. You start him and you start playing him 30 minutes, he's just never going to hold up. He's going to get injured. So if I can plug him in as a complete, talk about a change up to a fastball from Alperen Sengun, right? Couldn't be two more different bigs. As Sengun moves like he's walking in molasses that's hip deep and is super effective with what he does. And then Williams comes in and it's like, now this dude's jumping over my head. Right. And that's not a criticism on Sengun because Jokic doesn't move very fast and he's arguably the best player on the planet. So Embiid doesn't even move all that fast. And if Jokic isn't, it's Embiid, right? So we're in a spot where as long as you're effective, I don't really care. But it just when you could throw a completely different look at a team, that's huge. So think they could do that. Or they may look at it and say, hey, why not us? Why can't we beat out Utah? Or maybe Utah makes a move where it is, hey, they're going to kind of step back a little bit. I think we're in a spot where we could definitely see the Rockets make a move. It's like I've seen some people say, should they trade Jalen Green and draft picks and go all in on Zach LaVine? That doesn't make sense to me. Not now, not today.
Now, if we're talking
maybe in the
Bridges.
Summer, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Right. Maybe in the summer, like I would rather let's see what else comes available. But if there's a small move or two that really stabilizes the rest of the way for this team, that's great. But as it stands right now, I think just, hey, we're playing competitive games. We're in a position where it looks like we'll probably play competitive games all the way through. That's enough. You took your step forward.
Yeah.
Let next summer can be your add-on move. But if the right move's there now, go ahead and make it now. Because again, you benefit and you get the added benefit of, all right, we see how it looked. It maybe didn't look the way we wanted. We got to move something else. Or it doesn't look good with player X instead. So maybe that player becomes available or something along those lines. I think the Rockets are really set up nicely to go a lot of different ways here at the trade deadline and all the way into the summer.
And just the presence of those Oladipo's expiring almost $9.5 million, Jock Landale's non-guarantee for a little less than that next year, and even Jeff Green, $9 million, 9.6 this year, the club option next year. Like you're $26-27 million right there Green is a little different than those two because he actually still plays a role there, but that's money going to guys that you are just not using and don't have any future intentions about, that you can make that smaller or mid-tier move you're talking about, Keith, without going nuclear. We're talking about Jalen Green or anything else like even close to that.
You don't need to push everything in right now. You're not there. You're nowhere near there. Like it's a better place to just be smart, be cautious, like play the long game a little bit here. You think you've already shown more than enough improvement that everybody feels good about this season. You don't need to make them feel extra good by, hey, we were the 10th seed in the play-in and lost. Like that's fine if that's where it ends for the Rockets, but I wouldn't be chasing that by saying, oh, we got to go get, player X. Like now if player X is, yeah, we like him for the next 3 seasons. Sure. Go, make the move. So yeah, I think that's a great place to be in, honestly. And it kind of goes back to Grant. You mentioned related to the Thunder. This is kind of like my overall thought is, as I've followed this and followed the roster building stuff and talked to a lot of front office executives over the years, they will say the hardest decision publicly is breaking up a formerly special team to a city. So the example that gets used is when the Celtics traded Paul Pierce, Kevin Garnett away, it was telling the Celtics fans it's over, right? Like it's done. But they all say privately the hardest decision is when do we go for it?
Mm.
Right? It is as a young team that's building up. When is the time to go all in? Because if you do it too early, now you lost all your stuff to do it later. And if you wait too long, maybe the window's already closed on you before you even knew. So that becomes super fascinating to watch because there are feels like 7 or 8 teams that are in that boat of is now the right time. Like and it feels like for some of them, that window is like now or this summer, and that's it. Like then the window's gone and you don't have that ability. And that's something I'm very, very curious to keep watching with those teams. What do they do between now? And it's almost like this is an extended trade window where really for me, it is for some teams, it is today in the next week and a half till the trade deadline, all the way through till next July for a handful of these teams. There are some teams it's now or never, right? You got to do it. But it feels like, for a lot of teams, it is, when is the right time that you're looking to make those moves?
Keith, you gave us basically 100 minutes of your time. We are super appreciative as always and grateful that you came on and spent so much time talking to us. Are you able just to tell our listeners where they can find you and all the fantastic work that you do if they're not following you already?
Yeah, you can find my written work over on Spot Track. A lot of stuff up about the trade deadline. We have buyers and sellers up for both the Eastern Western Conference. I take a little bit of a different approach. I put like where they are from what we know, and then I put where I think they should be, like what their focus should be. Sometimes I'm in agreement. Like teams are in the right frame of mind, and then there's other times where I'm like, I maybe think about it differently. We also have like a trade primer up there, and then every time a trade goes down, sometime, hopefully within a couple hours, I'll have a written reaction, no matter if it's a small salary dump for a top 55 protected second round pick, or it is a real, trade, a blockbuster trade that came out of nowhere. And, there's a lot to break down. I'm going to have a reaction up to every single one. And if you like this kind of stuff, like really getting into the salary cap and roster stuff, NBA front office show with me and Trevor Lane, Monday through Friday. We do the show Monday through Thursday. We record, and then every Friday we do what we call Front Office Friday, which is for our fans, and we let them submit questions and ask things in the chat, and we have a lot of fun with it. Sometimes it gets completely sideways, and we end up talking about movies and all this other stuff. But it's ostensibly 90% about basketball, but we have a lot of fun on those Friday live shows, and I'll pump it here. Trade deadline day, we will be live probably for about a 4-hour window, a couple hours ahead of the deadline to a couple hours after, breaking down everything. Hopefully that happens. That there's a lot going on, and we get a lot of stuff to get into. Our hope every year is when the deadline kind of bell rings at 3 p.m. Eastern, that it's followed like it was that 1 year by Woj tweeting, "Oh Lord," after, because that means it was a pretty good trade deadline.
I would like to request humbly that they do a better job of getting the pick protections to us in these deals. I hate that on trade deadline day where it's just so-and-so's going to Charlotte for a first-round pick in 2 seconds, and we have no idea what those picks are for like
7 hours later. It comes out.
Yeah.
Or the following like Friday, Zach Lowe tucks it in a column somewhere. He's like, "Oh, by the way, those picks were this." Like it's I'm with you. Picks or even where it is like for me, I'm like, all right, this trade's not legal. Like someone else has to be traded. Or it's a 3-for-1. Somebody has to be waived. Like who's getting waived? Like, please tell me. Because otherwise, like I get super like stressed because I'm like, it's not going to be right on the site. We're going to have too many guys on Spot Track under the roster, and people are going to get upset with us. And I'll pump one other thing if I can very quickly.
Yeah, go ahead.
We launched our trade machine on Spot Track. We have an NBA trade machine that is up now. We think it is the most accurate and most extensive trade machine that's out there. I can assure you the rosters, one, are accurate. You're not going to find a guy who's not on the team anymore on any of the rosters, and the salaries are accurate too. I know that's missing components. I'll just say of a couple other options that are out there that people like to use. I've had a lot of people screenshot me and send me examples of, hey, this is wrong. And I'm like, that's great, but that's not our trade machine. I can't fix that. So now we do have our own trade machine. So now I just reply with the link to ours. And I'm like, here, use this one instead. We're working through the draft pick logic on trades, but we kind of wanted to get it out there so people could play with it, give us a bunch of feedback, and then we'll launch. The other thing that I know we have that nobody else has is you can toggle the restrictions on and off. So you can do no trade restrictions on, you can do trade deadline mode. So it's trade like where it'd be, this is what it would be on trade deadline day there. And then that'll be really helpful in the off season, I think, for people. If it's like, man, I want to trade this guy to see what it looks like when we flip to next year's salaries, you'll be able to shut the restrictions off and make a trade. If it's like his trade restriction lists on July 15th, of next year, like you can shut those off and go. So we're really excited that's out there, and it's right on the homepage. You just go to spottrack.com, you'll find it, and enjoy it, play with it, and send feedback, because we know there's things that can be improved.
I'll link to it in the podcast and YouTube description. And you were kind enough, I got to play around with it before you guys put it live, so it's great. It's the best one out there. So go check it out. Grant, are you ready to take us out of here?
Sure. Yeah. First and foremost, thanks to Keith for coming on with us. I know this is the time of year where time is precious for you and for everybody that's in this business. So extra thanks for that. Everyone follow at Keith Smith NBA. Check out SpotTrack. I personally will be using SpotTrack every single day I do it all year, but especially the next, 9 days, 10 days. It is an invaluable resource. You must be familiar with it if you want to know about the salary cap and follow the league correctly. And make sure that you don't try to trade, Mo Bamba from the Magic for Zach LaVine, because some other places still have him on the roster. And might let you do that even though the salaries are different. Follow Keith, follow us. All the socials are up on the screen. Rate, review, subscribe, thumbs up everywhere. Tell your friends, tell your enemies. We'll close this podcast as we close all of them by thanking Keith again, by giving a shout out to Frank Ntilikina, and by apologizing to Jared Allen.